Why is China building some of the world's tallest bridges in some of its most treacherous terrain? Not in Shanghai, not in Beijing, but deep in the mountains of Guizhou, a place that, for much of its history, was difficult enough to reach that few people wanted to go there. The Huajiang Bridge now rises 625 meters above the river below, cutting a journey across the canyon from roughly 2 hours to just 2 minutes. That sounds perfectly reasonable. A bridge makes travel easier, but something doesn't quite add up. If this were only about transportation, why did China then pour billions of dollars into this same region? Into defense manufacturing, data centers, and massive computing capacity? To understand that, let's step away from China for a moment and look at the United States. When America needed a military facility that absolutely could not afford to fail, it didn't put it in New York or Los Angeles. It carved one deep into Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, a granite bunker designed to keep operating even after a nuclear strike. The logic is simple. The harder a place is to reach, the harder it is to destroy. And that isn't a 20th century idea. Almost 1,800 years ago, a man in China was already pointing to the same principle, long before bombs, satellites, or missiles existed. His name was Zhu Liang. From his thatched cottage in Longzhong, he didn't advise Liu Bei to seize the richest territory in China. He pointed instead toward Yi Province, a region surrounded by mountains and so difficult to reach that the poet Li Bai would later write that the road to Shu was harder than climbing to heaven. And precisely because it was so difficult to enter, it was also difficult to attack. Zhu Liang described it as land that was dangerous yet rich. A place where a dynasty could establish itself in relative security because its enemies couldn't easily reach it. 3 stories. 3 completely different eras, but they share the same basic principle. The places that are hardest to reach can also become the places where a country protects what matters most. And that raises a very different question about Guizhou today. Is China applying that same principle all over again, right here? To understand why Guizhou matters, you have to start with the geography. The province sits deep in southwestern China, dominated by mountains, high plateaus, and deep ravines. It has no coastline, and for centuries it was separated from China's major economic centers by some of the country's most difficult terrain. That used to be a weakness. But when the Cold War began, the very thing that made Guizhou difficult to reach became something the coastal cities didn't have: strategic depth. Back in the 1960s, China was dealing with a very different threat than it faces today. If a major war broke out, industrial centers along the coast could become some of the first targets. So Beijing launched a massive national program known as the Third Front. The idea was straightforward. If critical factories and facilities were too close to vulnerable areas, move them deep into the interior. But you can't simply move a factory into the mountains and call it done. China had to build an entire system around these facilities. Factories, railways, roads, power infrastructure, cities, and, most importantly, defense-related industries. Guizhou sat directly inside that strategic zone. Today, those mountains are something China spends billions of dollars trying to overcome. During the Cold War, those same mountains were one of the reasons the region was chosen in the first place. The Third Front didn't just leave behind old factories and forgotten roads. It created an industrial legacy that included aviation, electronics, engines, drones, and other defense-related capabilities. So here's the question. If Guizhou was once chosen for its strategic value, did that role really disappear when the Cold War ended? Or did it simply change shape? Some of the industrial capacity built during the Third Front era is still there. Guizhou continues to develop industries tied to aviation, aircraft engines, electronics, drones, and defense manufacturing. In 2024, the provincial government identified defense and aerospace as one of the province's key industrial strengths. And then there's a detail that's harder to dismiss as coincidence. Tencent built a data center inside a mountain in Guizhou, designed with the ability to withstand bombing. Nobody armor plates a data center just to save money on electricity. Then something bigger began to change. What China was moving inland was no longer just factories, it was data and computing power. In late 2021, Beijing approved a national plan centered on 4 major data center clusters. Guizhou was selected as one of them. This wasn't simply a company looking for cheap land and room to stack servers. It was part of a national planning decision, alongside the kinds of infrastructure decisions that shape railways, airports, and power networks. In Guyana, one of the most concentrated data center hubs in Guizhou, there's a woman named Lai Jixiu. She told AFP that the arrival of these data centers had changed everyday life in her neighborhood. People who once had to leave to find work could now find jobs close to home. For her, that's simply what development looks like. But from a national perspective, her story is only one small piece of something much bigger. In 2021, China began building a national computing network known as Eastern Data, Western Computing, essentially moving data-intensive workloads from the country's eastern economic centers toward computing hubs in the West. Guizhou, along with Gansu and Inner Mongolia, became key links in that network. The official explanation is practical. Land is cheaper, power is cheaper, and the eastern cities face growing pressure on both. Some provincial governments have even subsidized electricity for data centers running domestic AI chips, in some cases cutting electricity costs by nearly half. Huawei and Tencent have built dozens of data centers in the region over just a few years. By the end of 2025, Guizhou's computing capacity had reportedly surpassed 150 exaflops, nearly triple its level a few years earlier. The target for 2026 was 190. But there's a problem. Some of that capacity has been underused. Power may be abundant, but the data still has to travel a long way to reach the people and businesses that actually need it. And that's where the story gets more interesting than simply building a giant warehouse full of servers. A division of labor has started to emerge. Guizhou can handle AI model training, the heavy, time-consuming work that doesn't require an immediate response. Meanwhile, computing centers closer to Guangzhou and other population centers can handle inference, the part that has to respond to millions of users in real time. In other words, Guizhou doesn't need millions of people using AI directly. It can become the place where the AI itself gets trained. A mountain province that was once among the poorest in China, now wired into the computing infrastructure serving the country's wealthier coastal cities. In the 20th century, China moved factories and strategic industries inland. In the 21st century, it's moving data and computing capacity there as well. The two may not serve exactly the same purpose, but they share one important characteristic. Both spread critical capacity away from the coast. At this point, we need to draw a line between what we know and what we're only inferring. We don't need to assume Beijing has some secret master plan stretching uninterrupted from the Cold War to the present. What we already know is remarkable enough. Guizhou was chosen decades ago for strategic industries because it was deep inland. Some of that industrial capacity survived. Today, the province continues to develop aviation, electronics, engines, and industries connected to national defense. At the same time, Guizhou has become an important link in China's national computing network. And there are 3 more details worth paying attention to. In 2026, the Guizhou government officially identified security as a priority for its data centers and computing networks. That same year, provincial leaders attended a military district conference focused on defense mobilization and national defense construction. And in 2025, when severe flooding hit Rongjiang County, tens of thousands of soldiers and militia were mobilized within days to help with evacuations, rescue operations, and infrastructure recovery. None of these facts, by themselves, proves a secret military plan, but put them side by side, and the picture becomes harder to ignore. Guizhou is no longer just an economic development zone. Taken individually, every piece has a perfectly ordinary explanation. A poor province needs development. It needs more computing power, more data centers, better roads, and more reliable infrastructure. And when a natural disaster strikes, the military helps save lives. Something governments around the world do. Nothing about that is inherently mysterious. But here's where the question changes. If you're a country whose population, industry, and economic centers are concentrated largely along the eastern coast, what is the value of a region deep inland? One that has computing power, defense-related industry, and the ability to mobilize tens of thousands of people within days? It's not just about cheaper land. It's not just about abundant power. It's about location. A factory on the coast and a factory deep inland can make the same product. A data center in the east and one in the west can process the same kind of data. But in a major crisis, they are not equally vulnerable. And that's where Guizhou's story starts to matter. Not because we've proven the existence of some secret plan, but because so many of the capabilities being built here share the same effect. They make part of China's national capacity less dependent on the coastal centers. That's a very different thing. But there's a cost here that shouldn't be ignored. Le Monde, after examining Guizhou's development, described it as a model in miniature. Massive infrastructure can bring connectivity and economic growth, but it can also leave behind a mountain of local debt. Even strategic depth comes at a price. So let's look at the simplest possible version of the argument. Assume there is no secret military plan at all. Guizhou would still need highways. It would still need data centers, power, and connections to China's major cities. None of that is unusual. But change one thing. Put all of those systems deep inside a mountainous region, far from the coast. The picture starts to look different. Maybe the real question isn't, is China secretly building a military base in Guizhou? Maybe the better question is China turning a region once seen as a geographic disadvantage into a kind of backup for the national system? Those are two completely different questions. And the second one can actually be tested by looking at what is being built. This may be the simplest way to understand Guizhou. A modern nation doesn't rely on tanks or military bases alone. It also depends on electricity, roads, factories, and data. Things that have to keep running when part of the system breaks down. Imagine a major crisis. A transportation route is disrupted. A data center goes offline. An industrial zone is cut off. If critical capacity is concentrated in just a few places, the shock can spread quickly. But if it's distributed in advance, the system gains another layer of protection. That may be one of the advantages Guizhou is creating. And that's why the boundary between economic infrastructure and strategic infrastructure is becoming harder to define. There is no evidence that China is secretly building a fortress in the mountains. But what we can see is simpler. A region once turned into a geographic disadvantage by its own terrain is now being connected, industrialized, and digitized at enormous speed. When that capacity sits deep inland, it gains something coastal centers don't have: depth. Maybe it's simply economic development. Maybe strategic resilience is just a side effect. But the original question has changed. It's no longer, why build a bridge that tall? It's, why is a region once isolated by its mountains being connected to more and more of China's critical systems? Not necessarily a fortress, but depth.